So let's talk about systems biology and a little bit about emergent properties as well. Systems biology is really just the term that we use to break down the science of biology into its kind of interacting pieces to get a better understanding of biology as a whole. So again, if you think of biology as a system, right? I know when we think of biology, we think of just life in general, right? But if you think of it as a system of all the different ideas and databases and theories and laws that come together to kind of paint the picture of life as we currently understand it, a lot of times when we do that, we like to break it down into these kind of interacting themes that give us a better understanding of how biology works as a whole. And systems biology is just the models and the different behaviors that we are trying to understand to get a better view of the system of biology as a whole. Realistically speaking, we are trying to understand all of the different interacting models that give us the dynamic behavior of biology. That's what systems biology is. And so when we are doing that, a lot of times we will study the specific emergent properties or the ways that those interacting systems can occur at each different level, or breaking it down into its parts to understand the system. And a lot of times when we do this concept of systems biology, or we talk about the idea of emergent properties, a lot of times you'll hear this phrase, the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, right? And all that's basically saying is if you're going to study something like a cell, and you're going to understand all the different organelles inside of it and enzymes and all those things interacting together, that those interactions by themselves don't give you the cell. It's not until you put them all together inside of that cell membrane that you get the interaction of the cell. And so the system is the cell. The emergent properties are all those different pieces that we're trying to understand to get a grasp of what's actually occurring inside of that cell. And I like to use the example of oncology. So if we want to understand cancer, we definitely need to understand how cells work, right? Because a cell is going to be kind of that lowest level of hierarchy study that is going to give us that cancer tumor, right? But realistically, even that's not totally true, right? Because if I need to do that, I need to understand what is a cell's life cycle. How is that cell behaving normally? How is it behaving if it's a cancerous cell, if it's a tumor? So to do that, we're going to break down what a cell is, what a cell does, what's inside of a cell, understand how that cell lives and behaves both normally and naturally, and when it's affected by the tumor properties. And then in order to do that, we're going to have to understand things like those different enzymes and proteins and different pathways occurring inside of the cell that are keeping that cell alive. But to understand that, we need to understand the genes that are building those proteins. And we can do this forever, right? We can take it down all the way into the individual atoms and interactions of proteins. But realistically, what we're doing when we're breaking down those properties, we are using something called reductionism. Kind of think of it as the hierarchy from the cell all the way down to the nitty-gritty enzymes and proteins and atoms interacting within that system. And so if the emergent property is the theme, which is all that different interactions and all those different pieces together that give us the cell, think of reductionism as the tool that helps us to understand each level of those different interactions. And so again, if we're looking at this from the standpoint of something like a cancer tumor, you're going to probably start off looking at the tumor itself, maybe the tumor microenvironment. What is it doing that's causing the problem? What's it doing inside of the patient's body? You're probably eventually going to get to the point nowadays where we're looking at the different gene interactions and the proteins that are maybe irregular. All of these are different emergent properties that are going to eventually give us a better understanding of the tumor, right? And from that, we're getting all sorts of new technologies, new treatments, understanding how the tumor is changing inside of the body, understanding how we can use things like maybe immunotherapy to prevent those resistance from occurring, and hopefully getting to a point where we get personalized medicine for the individual who's affected and hopefully curing them. That's the goal of that system. Understanding it as the emergent properties, breaking it down to its pieces, that's the reductionism. And you do this a lot of times in ecosystem studies too. And so if we're talking about studying all of life on the planet Earth, which that would be cool, but that's a really big level of study, we call that the biosphere. But a lot of times we don't just look at biospheres. We might break it down into an individual biome, or really a lot of times, and this is why we kind of call it ecology, a lot of times we study them at the ecosystem level, the interactions of the living things and the non-living things. Maybe you're talking specifically about just some specific living thing interactions, or maybe just one population within that ecosystem. But all of these are different ways of reducing down this big system of biology, or this biosphere, into its parts to get a better understanding of the complexities of the system as a whole. That is systems biology. That's emergent properties, because we're looking at all of these different pieces interacting to give us the system. And then a lot of times when we do that, we use reductionism to break it down into the smallest parts to get the best level of understanding. I always think, when I'm thinking of emergent properties, when I'm thinking of reductionism, I always think of taxonomy, right? And I know we don't teach a ton of taxonomy anymore in school, but this is like domain, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species, all of these different things. This is the whole system of understanding the organisms maybe within an ecosystem. And you can study at every one of these different levels, right? These are kind of what I think of as the reductionist level of study. I can go from kingdom Animalia, which are all of our animals, right, to just specifically ones that have that nerve cord, which is chordata, the ones specifically that feed with mammillary glands, which gives us mammalia. The emergent properties are the things that make them in that group. All members of the phylum Chordata have a central nerve cord. That's the emergent property. The reductionism is how we then break it down further into the mammals or individual bear or whatever that might be. And since we're talking about ecology a little bit here, great place to throw in that theme of organism interactions. And so this, I always think of it as the key ecology ecosystem study theme in biology. And this one is enormous. You can spend a lifetime studying just this one theme in the world of ecology. But really, when we're talking about organism interactions, we're almost always talking about the exchange of energy and matter within a system, right? We're talking about the potential chemical bonds of the different sugars and proteins inside of the bodies of prey organisms, the kinetic energy, the energy actually being utilized by maybe the herbivores when they eat the plants, or the predators when they actually eat the herbivores. This interaction is going to give us this theme where we're following the energy and we're following the matter throughout the system. And a lot of times this goes all the way back around to, like, our vulture here or decomposers here, and the energy exchanging within that ecosystem. When we're doing that, a lot of times you'll hear this rule of 10 come up, because this is specifically talking about the energy within the system, right? And so if you talk about all of the energy coming from the sun, which, it's hard to quantify there, but if we look at specifically what is being absorbed at that initial level by those lovely photosynthetic producers there, like our plants, they kind of give us the start off of the amount of energy within an ecosystem. Some ecosystems have a lot of energy at this producer level, like grasslands and forests. Some have very small amounts, things like, deserts and the Arctic region. But in almost every situation where you have those primary producers, you are going to have those primary consumers, which are things like your herbivores that are eating the seeds and the plants and the nectar and things like that. But guys, the rule of 10 is this idea that at each trophic level, which is what we call kind of every step on this pyramid, that 90% of the energy is actually lost and only 10% of the energy is actually being utilized by that next trophic level. And when I say lost, I mean lost into things like waste, heat waste, waste production, makes it to that next level. That's why we call it the rule of 10. And so when we're talking about something like the number of mice in that ecosystem, you may notice biomass is going to be pretty equivalent to only about 10% of the biomass of the plants in that system. And there's some give or take there depending on resistances and defenses and things like that. But about 10% primary consumers will exist in an ecosystem compared to the biomass of the plants. Go to the secondary consumer level here, you're going to find only about 1% of the biomass, meaning you get a lot less snakes than you get mice in the ecosystem. Go up to the more apex tertiary quaternary levels here, you're going to have 0.1%, or maybe 1/100% of the energy depending upon the number of consumers. And so that's why you get a lot less eagles or hawks in a given ecosystem than you're going to see mice or plants. That's the rule of 10. And last thing to talk about here, if we're talking about moving things through a trophic level, I'd be remiss to not talk about the idea of biological magnification. This is less about energy, but it is an important eco theme where we're talking about toxins moving from one level to the next. And you've probably heard of this before, where you get, something like a mercury or something like that building up in, small levels inside of the phytoplankton in an ecosystem. But then you have the primary consumers that are getting more of those toxins, and then the secondary consumers that are getting more of those toxins, and the small fish eat the small phytoplankton, which give us more of those toxins, and the big fish eat lots of those small fish, so they're getting more of those toxins until you eventually get to that apex level where the toxins are building up in very, very high levels. That's one of the reasons why you probably heard you shouldn't eat too much of, large fish or large animals because of the buildup of things like mercury in their bodies, that you then become that apex predator, and you start seeing that build up inside of your bodies. We're actually seeing this with microplastics right now, which is a concerning idea where, a small amount in things like phytoplanktons or zooplanktons, but as you kind of move up the food chain, you're getting more and more of these microplastics building up inside of the body, which, it's still to be seen exactly what that's going to look like for us, but it certainly is concerning, right?